On the surface, the requirement to value a fund's assets annually seems relatively straightforward. However, the ATO has declared that they are continuing to identify cases where self-managed superannuation fund trustees and practitioners are submitting asset valuations that are either inaccurate, outdated, or missing key supporting evidence. Naomi Kewley is the Managing Director of Peak Super Audits, and she joins me today to discuss this point further. Thank you very much for joining me today, Naomi.
It's good to be here talking about market valuations in self-managed super funds. Yes, thank you.
We're seeing from the ATO that they've obviously signaled several times that they're going to intensify their compliance focus when it comes to scrutinizing asset valuations, particularly when it comes to property assets. Why do you think the ATO is taking that position?
Yes, well, that's a good question. The ATO has certainly increased its focus on the valuation of self-managed super fund assets. And I think that is largely the result of the regulator looking to close a fairly significant gap between common practice and the actual exercise of valuing assets in compliance with Regulation 8.02b. So anyone involved with self-managed super funds will know that the annual revaluation of assets is not a new rule. It's been a requirement since 2013. Prior to that, you only had to revalue assets when starting a pension or if the fund had in-house asset issues. But I think old habits die hard. The old industry practice was to revalue assets once every 3 years, and a valuation within that time was considered more or less current, and therefore satisfying the annual reassessment requirement. But if you stop to think about it, that was pretty absurd because fund assets could be grossly misstated applying that old rule of thumb. Property values, as we've seen, can move spectacularly in 12 months' time. So if as an auditor, I see property value in the financials unchanged from 1 year to the next, it's a red flag that goes up for me right away. And I think it's fair to say that the regulator has similar concerns. So I think it's a positive thing that the industry is getting this scrutiny. I think it's all about closing the gap between what has been regular practice and the expectation that is in line with Reg 8.02b.
Oh, great. Well, thank you, Naomi. And that's actually a nice segue into the next question that I was going to ask is the SIS regulations, and you mentioned there Regulation 802b, that seems to define the concept of market value sort of reasonably clearly. But however, the act of establishing the market value of an asset with supporting evidence is really another matter entirely. What are some of the issues that you've come across maybe in your own practice or that you've seen more broadly in the industry with sort of substantiating the market value of an asset?
Well, that question's as long as a piece of string, isn't it? I see quite a few challenges. In terms of practical challenges, hassle and cost are two big barriers that we have to overcome when dealing with fund administrators and trustees. They're frequent objections. And let's face it, valuing assets isn't necessarily easy. If you involve a professional valuer to value the property, it's not going to be cheap either. Residential homes and units are one thing. Commercial and rural properties, I see, involve real pain on that hassle and cost front. Like people say to me, but the asset, it's really hard to value. How on earth can we find comparatives? They look at me with pain in their eyes to say, what are you asking me to do? This is just so hard. Or they say, look, we got it professionally valued last year. It was a great job. We paid a fortune for it. Isn't that good enough? And I feel that pain. As auditors, we really do have to hold the line on this, though. Annual revaluations are a requirement, and that's that. I do think, though, it's really important as auditors that we help trustees and administrators understand their options. Some properties are just going to be unique. You're not going to find comparative recent sales, so it's stupid to ask people to go and find them. For commercial property, it can help to conduct a market valuation based on rental yield. Administrators do need to be careful with this, particularly if we're dealing with a related tenant. So as an auditor, then I would need to see both an independent rental valuation and also an independent opinion as to what is a reasonable yield for that kind of property. But I think undertaken correctly, property valuations that are based on rental yield can provide good audit evidence, and they're often a good solution, particularly an interim solution to save the fund engaging a professional valuer every year to assess the warehouse. It saves on that cost.
And I noticed that you just mentioned that requirement to value assets annually. And interestingly, you sort of pointed out something recently, and you've identified that with some of the recent guidance that the ATO has released in regards to valuations, specifically referring here to QC 26343, a small section of that guidance appears to directly contradict some of the regulatory obligations of trustees and auditors with regards to that annual requirement. Can you give us a little more insight into that discrepancy?
Yeah, so this is a tough one. I remember reading that section in the QC when it came out. So I think you're referring here to the QC suggestion that when a professional property valuation has been obtained, a trustee will not necessarily have to obtain a valuation each year. And I do find that statement a bit confusing, particularly based on my own conversations with the ATO, understanding that their expectation is that auditors will obtain sufficient and appropriate valuation evidence each year. So that's going to mean evidence relevant to the property's value at 30th of June in the year of audit. And a prior year valuation is going to come in underweight. So yes, if property prices have not moved at all since the prior year valuation was conducted, then the prior year assumptions and the analysis of data in that valuation may still be relevant. But I think the question we have to ask is, how will the trustees know this? And how will I know it as an auditor unless the property's market value is reassessed? Someone has to look at the market again and form a new opinion as to the property's value. So this does not mean that you need a qualified independent valuation every year. But I think someone does need to perform a valuation assessment on an annual basis, even if it is a trustee assessment based on current market data. And I just would like to say this QC provides really solid support for auditors in most aspects. This one part, I think, could use some fine tuning.
And just as a final question to conclude, and I know, again, this question could be taken in many different ways, but in your professional opinion, are there any really sort of hard rules to live by for practitioners and trustees when it comes to valuations?
Yeah, well, I think it really is about common sense, isn't it? So I think about the evidence. When you present your auditor with an asset valuation and supporting evidence, then it needs to represent reality. It can't be something that you've imagined or thought would be nice to have presented in the financials. The evidence has to back up reality. I think there are two good litmus tests for this. So first of all, I say to people, look, if your life depended on convincing an impartial judge that your property's value is XYZ, would you have a good argument? Would you be able to walk out of there with your life? Would you be able to convince someone who is impartial that this is actually the property's value? Second litmus test, if your friend offered to buy the fund's property tomorrow at the value presented in the financials, would you sell it? If you wouldn't, then I think you need to be thinking very carefully if the property is correctly presented at that value in the financial statements. We're talking about reality here. We're talking about evidence that backs up reality. And if either of those two questions make you uncomfortable, then you may have trouble with your auditor if they're doing a good job.
Well, as I mentioned previously, Naomi is the managing director of Peak Super Audits, an award-winning firm based out of Tasmania, offering a comprehensive suite of auditing services for self-managed superannuation funds. thank you so much for joining me today, and I really look forward to speaking with you again soon.
You're welcome. Thank you so much for the opportunity.